The air is hot and sticky with intense jungle humidity. You hear the bugs and the birds singing in the heat and the sun, but it feels like you're in the worst kind of dream. It's over 100 degrees, but you feel the coldest you've ever felt. You shiver, and your head aches so badly. All you want is to drift away until this passes. But before you can let sleep take you, suddenly you are overcome with nausea and lean over the side of your bed reaching for the bucket. You feel your entire abdomen squeeze, and your face feels like it's being pressed inside of ice. You vomit, and for just a moment you feel a hint of sweet relief, just before your eyes open and you see the bucket is filled with foreboding blackness. And you don't know if you're going to make it out of this alive. Hi, my name is Shelby, and this is Merrily Morbid, the channel where we explore all things that are at least a little bit dark, from deadly diseases to natural disasters, from true crime to man-made catastrophes. So if that's your kind of thing, come along and let's get morbid. You may be surprised to learn that there are 16 hemorrhagic fevers known to affect humans, but today we are going to be looking at 7 of them. I should also say that Hanta, Nipah, and Hendra viruses are often grouped together with the hemorrhagic fevers since they are high-consequence infectious diseases. But since they don't directly cause bleeding and it's generally a complication, we will be covering those in another video. Now, the hemorrhagic fevers are all caused by viruses that fall into 4 viral families: the Arenaviridae, Filoviridae, Bunyaviridae, and Flaviviridae. Arenaviridae viruses include dozens of hemorrhagic fevers, but notably Lassa Fever. Filoviridae includes a dozen hemorrhagic fevers, but only 2 are known to cause illness in humans: Marburg and the notorious Ebola virus. Now, Bunyaviridae viruses include Crimean-Congo Hemorrhagic Fever and Rift Valley Fever. And finally, we have Flaviviridae, and those are the most prolific and deadliest in terms of worldwide numbers. The hemorrhagic fevers in that family include yellow fever and dengue fever, but are also home to non-hemorrhagic diseases like West Nile, Zika, and hepatitis C. All hemorrhagic fevers are zoonotic, meaning that they come from animal reservoirs. Illness follows a bite, contact with an infected animal's bodily fluids, or close contact with a sick human. And with hemorrhagic fevers, it doesn't take much to make a person sick. There's something called an infectious dose, and it's the number of viruses required to make a person sick. For example, it takes between 300 and 2,000 COVID-19 virus particles to make a person sick. For Salmonella, that number ranges between 1,000 and 1 million viral particles. Unfortunately for humans, the number it takes to become sick with any of the hemorrhagic fevers is only between 1 in 10. That's it. It can take only a single viral particle to make you sick. It just ups the fear factors with these bloody fevers. Okay, but how do hemorrhagic fevers cause the bleeding that they're famous for? Well, simply put, there are a couple ways that they wreak havoc. The first is by attacking the blood vessels throughout the body. With their structures damaged, blood and plasma can leak out. You see this primarily in areas of the body with mucous membranes: the eyes, the nose, the mouth, even the gastrointestinal tract. The liver is also often attacked. Fun fact, it's responsible for producing most of the body's blood clotting factors. What this means is that the pipes are leaking and there's no way to plug the holes. Affected people can bleed from injection sites and IV sites. They can have large amounts of bruising beneath the skin. The abdomen can fill with fluid, which prevents the lungs from fully expanding. The lungs themselves can also fill with fluid, a condition called pulmonary edema, which causes respiratory distress. Bleeding into the GI tract can cause bloody vomit and bloody diarrhea. It's safe to say it's a hell of an experience to go through. I have to dispel a common myth about hemorrhagic fevers, though, before we move on. The bleeding is not explosive. That is a Hollywood myth used to make the disease scarier, which is insane because it's all pretty horrifying on its own. It's also important to know that most of us watching this will never have to worry about most of these illnesses. Unfortunately for the rest of the world, these fevers are a real risk. Why? I'll give you 2 quotes from my favorite podcast. This podcast will kill you. The first quote is regarding why developing countries have higher mortality rates of these diseases. Quote, "These news articles rarely mention that perhaps things like inadequate healthcare infrastructure, inadequate pathogen testing, inadequate isolation facilities, inadequate access to PPE, personal protection equipment, and other socio-political factors could play a role in driving that number higher than it should be." Meaning, essentially, that people who are most at risk are living in countries where they don't have the supplies, the money, or political pull to ensure that the people have access to healthcare that they need. The other quote is articles, quote, "sometimes mention that we do have the vaccines in the works, but they may not mention that they are already likely equipped scientifically to bring those vaccines from the lab into the real world, but we lack the funds because these are rare diseases that happen, quote unquote, over there." Literally meaning that the only thing needed to make sure that these people have access to preventative vaccines is money. And the reason why they don't get that money is that it's not considered our problem. That is, until it becomes our problem. I think it's time to introduce you to our first hemorrhagic disease. But first, here's the part where I ask you to hit the subscribe button. It costs you nothing and helps me grow my channel. It takes just a moment, and while you're down there, go and tap the like button too. All right, first up is Lassa Fever. Lassa fever of the Arenaviridae family is endemic, meaning natively found, in Western African countries of Nigeria, Benin, Guinea, Liberia, Mali, and Sierra Leone. Initial cases of these outbreaks are caused by a person being exposed to contaminated pee or poo from this little creature, the multi-mammate rat. P.S. It's actually a mouse. Does it matter? Probably not, but I just had to say it. Anyway, moving on. Generally, after Lassa has spilled over into the human population, further cases are caused by human-to-human transmission. And the higher the number of viruses or virus particles in a person's body, the more contagious they become. In spite of not being a very well-known illness, there are hundreds of thousands of cases each year in Western Africa, with thousands of them dying. On day 1, a person is exposed to the Lassa fever virus. Say they were exposed by a contagious person. That means that they have come into contact with contaminated blood, saliva, or urine of a very sick person. Maybe they were there helping take care of that person. The majority of people never actually show any symptoms, or they have mild flu-like symptoms that are easily mistaken for other bugs. But for the unlucky ones, within 1 to 3 weeks, they will start to show symptoms, and up to 20% will have severe and life-threatening symptoms, which can include chest pain, stomach pain, difficulty breathing, severe vomiting and diarrhea, seizures, confusion, shock, organ damage, and organ failure. Sadly, Lassa fever is also devastating with pregnancies, with between 75 and 95 of them ending in miscarriages and stillbirth. Once symptoms appear, they usually last between 10 and 15 days, and the only medical care that can be given is usually supportive care, i.e. IV fluids, oxygen, medications, etc. There is a single medication that can be used for patients fighting Lassa fever, and that's ribavirin. The problem with that is it's expensive, not easily accessible where it's needed most, and on top of all of that, it's only helpful if it's given within the first few days after a person becomes sick. One major thing that sets Lassa fever apart from the other hemorrhagic fevers is that 1 in 3 people who show symptoms will have some degree of hearing loss, and for many, it is permanent. Like other hemorrhagic fevers, though, severe cases can kill. Death, when it happens, is usually caused by a combination of respiratory failure, organ failure, and shock caused by blood loss. Thankfully, Lassa has one of the lowest mortality rates, with only about 1% dying. There are currently 2 different vaccines in the works. One is in phase 2 trials, and the other has just entered phase 1 trials. But that one would not only protect against Lassa fever, but also against rabies. That's a pretty good 2-for-1 deal. So, now that you know where we are now, let's go back to Lassa fever's beginning. The first officially identified case was that of Lily Penny Pinneo back in 1969. She was an American nurse working at a hospital in Jos, Nigeria, and she worked there since its founding when she was its only staff member. Another nurse working in a little village called Lassa was hit by a hemorrhagic fever. That unnamed nurse was flown to the Bingham Hospital in Jos, where she died less than 24 hours later. A week later, another nurse fell ill with the same mysterious fever, and she too died. It wasn't long before one of the nurses that had taken care of the other 2 nurses had also come down with the illness too, Penny, and she became incredibly sick. At one point, her temperature was an insane 107 degrees. That's 41.6 degrees Celsius. She was so sick that she was flown back to the United States, where she would spend the next 9 weeks. While she was in the hospital, samples of her blood were sent to Yale, where the virus was isolated and then named for the village where the first case appeared, Lassa. The doctor who discovered the virus also became sick, but luckily survived. A research technician wasn't so lucky. The doctor was given serum from the nurse, Penny, who had already begun recovering. It's believed it's the only reason that he survived. Now, after fully recovering from Lassa fever, Penny amazingly returned to Nigeria and kept working as a nurse, but also began working as a researcher to fight against Lassa fever. She regularly donated her blood so that it could be used to save others from Lassa. She continued to work another 15 years in Nigeria before retiring and returning to the States. But she always had a great love for Nigeria and the decades that she spent there. She passed away in 2012 at 95 years old, more than 40 years after she was the first person to survive Lassa fever. In 2020, the Nigeria CDC built a state-of-the-art facility with the aim to fight back against Lassa fever and other infectious diseases, and they named it the Pinneo Infectious Disease Center in honor for all that she did. It should never be forgotten, though, that as with many illnesses, especially in less developed areas of the world, the first identified cases usually aren't the first actual cases. There is evidence that Lassa fever emerged back in the early 50s. That's almost 2 decades before it was officially identified. Let's talk about Ebola's older but less famous cousin, Marburg. Although this fever originated in sub-Saharan Africa and is most often found there today, Marburg Fever was first discovered in 1967 when 3 different labs in Europe received shipments of grivets, aka African green monkeys, from Entebbe, Uganda. One lab was in Marburg, Germany, one was in Frankfurt, Germany, and in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, or modern-day Serbia, was the third. Pause. Trigger warning for animal cruelty. The monkeys were meant to be killed when they arrived so that their kidneys could be used to culture polio for making vaccines. Ironically, these green monkeys were chosen instead of the iconic rhesus macaques because it was believed that these monkeys were free of viruses and other illnesses. They should have been safer to work with. Mother Nature often laughs in our faces, though, doesn't she? Anyway, as you can probably guess, these monkeys weren't healthy. They were very, very sick. 300 monkeys in groups of 100 were sent to Belgrade alone, and following usual protocol, they were immediately put into quarantine before they would be used in the lab. During the quarantine period, 21 monkeys in the first group died, 32 in the second, and a whopping 46 of the third group died. That's damn near a third of all the monkeys. As you can imagine, that's not freaking normal. A vet was called in to do necropsies, aka autopsies, on the monkeys to try to figure out what the hell was going on, and the poor guy himself was soon very sick. At the time, they had no idea that at least one of the monkeys had been exposed to a new virus that is carried by the Egyptian russet bat, or the common Egyptian fruit bat. They also had no idea that the illness could be easily spread through the contaminated bodily fluids of animals and even humans. That vet, he ended up infecting his wife while she was taking care of him. Luckily for both of them, they both ended up recovering from their bouts with Marburg, but not everyone was so lucky. Of the 20 people who got sick in Marburg and the 4 that got sick in Frankfurt, 7 of them wouldn't survive. When the chain of infection was traced back, it was easily seen that all of the illnesses were traceable back to the monkeys. Something crazy about the situation was that months after everyone who had survived had gotten better, one of the wives of the scientists suddenly became sick. How the hell could that happen? Well, it turns out that Marburg virus can be found in semen long after a person recovers from it. I'll let you figure out how that one happened. But sadly, the 7 victims of the virus who died weren't the only victims of the outbreak. Of course, all the monkeys were put down, but all of the polio vaccines that had been made from the monkeys had to be thrown out. It actually led to a shortage of polio vaccines in Europe for a while. Eventually, it was proven that the monkeys had been infected in the wild in Africa when the virus showed up again in neighboring Zimbabwe in 1975. So, where are we with Marburg fever today? Since its discovery, we've learned a bit more. We now know that there are 2 separate strains of the virus, Marburg and Ravin, that can cause Marburg virus. We know that the incubation ranges from 2 to 21 days after exposure, but most people will become sick within 5 to 10 days. The first 4 to 5 days usually have symptoms like high fever, chills, headaches, sore throat, muscle aches, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and somewhat unique to Marburg, a rash on the torso, which could be raised or flat. Then, on days 5 to 13, a person may experience symptoms getting worse, such as liver failure, delirium, bleeding, and hemorrhaging, shock, and organ dysfunction. Unlike Lassa, there are no medications that can be given, and the only treatments are supportive. If a person dies from Marburg, it's most likely to happen between days 8 and 6 after they first become sick, and usually it's caused by shock or organ failure or a combination of the two. And the death rate is pretty high. At the low end, Marburg kills 20% of its victims, and at the high end, it's 90%. But even if a person survives, it's a long road back to health. Symptoms can continue for weeks or even months, and all that time, they are still contagious. The good news is that Marburg does remain pretty rare. To date, there have only been 593 known cases. Unfortunately, 446 of those people died. That's 75%. Better news than Marburg still being pretty rare is that there are 2 separate vaccines in development, and they are both in trial phases. So here's to a Marburg-less future. Perhaps the most famous member of the filovirus family and the cousin of Marburg is Ebola. The family resemblance is strong. Ebola symptoms are very similar and include high fever, fatigue, muscle pain, headache, sore throat, vomiting, diarrhea, and a rash. An Ebola death is similar to Marburg too, as it usually follows shock and organ failure. Something interesting about Ebola is that in spite of its bloody reputation, bleeding doesn't actually always happen. In fact, it only happens in about half of symptomatic cases. Crazier still is that up to a fifth of Ebola cases are actually asymptomatic, meaning they show no symptoms or noticeable symptoms. When a person does experience its hallmark bleeding, you can see them bleed from the eyes, their nose, their gums, and of course, as with all the hemorrhagic fevers, a person will bleed internally. Also similar to Marburg, Ebola's natural reservoir, meaning the species where it's normally found, is bats, and specifically fruit bats. But disclaimer here, although bats are believed to be the culprit when it comes to Ebola, it's never been 100% proven to be the case. When an animal is a natural reservoir, they aren't susceptible to the virus and they're just carriers. That's why, even though we know that people can get sick through contact with sick primates, we know that primates aren't the actual natural reservoir. Otherwise, they wouldn't be showing the signs of the illness. Now, Ebola has 6 different strains known to cause illness in humans, and they are all known for where they were first discovered. There's Sudan, Bundibugyo, Reston, Tai Forest, and Zaire. And Zaire is the deadliest, with the fatality rates going all the way up to 90%. Almost every disease in this video is named after a place it was found, and Ebola is no different. It was named for the nearby river in the modern-day Democratic Republic of the Congo, or the DRC. And the first strain was called Zaire, the DRC's colonial name. And since we're already talking about it, let's talk about Ebola's emergence. 9 years after Marburg fever suddenly appeared in Europe, a new hemorrhagic fever appeared just as suddenly in Africa. A headmaster of a local school named Mabala Lokela arrived at a mission hospital in Yambuku on August 26, 1976. He had a fever, and at the time, the obvious diagnosis would have been malaria, a common mosquito-borne parasitic infection. Lokela was given anti-malarial medication, chloroquine, and sent home to recover. And had it been malaria, he probably would have gotten better. But he didn't have malaria. Just over a week later, he returned to the hospital, and by that time, he was in rough shape. He had severe internal bleeding. They immediately admitted him, but really there was nothing that they could do, and he passed away only 3 days later. And soon enough, 21 others were sick. Religious traditions in the area mean that the bodies of the dead are handled intimately by friends and family. They hold the body, wash the body, dress the body. People aren't aware how incredibly contagious the bodies are. So after Lokela died and so many people had contact with him, they became sick, the investigation began. Samples were taken from these sick patients, which were then sent to the CDC, and what scientists saw under the microscope was pretty shocking. This virus looked familiar, but was a little different from what they'd seen before. It looked so similar to Marburg, and it behaved so much like Marburg, but it wasn't. It was certainly related, but it was different enough to be classified as a brand new virus. Within mere months, another Ebola outbreak happened, this time in Sudan, another strain of the new virus. By this time, the outbreak was over and there were 318 cases and 280 deaths, but the beast seemed to fall asleep. Now, for the next 38 years, outbreaks occurred periodically. One of them had over 400 victims, but most were limited to a handful or even a few dozen. We had no idea how bad it could get. In December 2013, a 2-year-old little boy in the Guinea village Miliandu became very sick. The boy was no match for the Ebola virus that took over his little body, and sadly, he passed away just days after he began showing symptoms. Because Ebola had never been found in the area before, it wasn't suspected. It meant that there was a severe delay in the response to the outbreak, and the virus spread like wildfire. By the time the outbreak had been officially declared on March 23, 2014, there had already been 49 cases and 29 deaths. The spread was made worse by the lack of healthcare infrastructure, lack of funding, lack of supplies, and a lack of medical professionals. There was also a distrust of doctors. If you think about it from the local perspective, you live in a former colony, so you already have a distrust of foreigners. One day, people who don't speak your language show up in these weird bubble suits and they take your sick family members away. You aren't allowed to see them, and because of the infrastructure, you aren't even allowed to speak to them. All you know is that they are alone and suffering, and then if they die, their body is not returned to you so you can give them a proper burial. They are burned, and you never even got to say goodbye. You can see why people may have been scared to go get medical attention. Unfortunately, this led to more victims and more victims. The first victims were in Guinea, but before long, Liberia and Sierra Leone were up to their necks in Ebola patients. By the time the epidemic was declared over, it had been 2 years and it had been far more destructive than ever before. This pandemic sickened 28,000 and left 11,000 dead. We had never imagined Ebola could cause so much devastation. But the truth is, it could have been so much worse. The first Ebola vaccine wasn't available until a year into the epidemic. Although it wasn't approved until 2019, it began to be used under compassionate use rules in 2015. They were able to use a method called ring vaccination. This picture here regarding COVID depicts ring vaccination. This method means that everyone who is known to be in contact with a sick person gets the vaccine, along with anyone who was in contact with those people. So forget 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, we're talking 2 degrees of Ebola. Anyway, another thing that happened was people who survived their bout with Ebola were asked to help fight back. Since immunity after the illness is 100%, the survivors could go into the villages without the fear of getting sick and speak to people peer to peer to educate them on how to stay safe and reduce the spread of Ebola. It was called the Ebola Survivors Corps, and that's pretty cool in my opinion. So let's talk about today. There are treatments available now for some Ebola patients. And Suvimab, the brand name Ebanga, and Inzimab, both are monoclonal antibody medications and are given as IV infusions. They work by neutralizing the Ebola virus and preventing them from attaching to cells in the body, as well as helping the body identify and attack the cells that have already been infected by the virus. It's only approved for the Zaire strain, and there are no approved treatments yet for the other Ebola strains. As of July 17th, 2026, there is a current outbreak of the Bundibugyo strain of the Ebola virus affecting the DRC and Uganda. The cases are still rising and are currently at 2,124 known cases and 828 deaths as of the recording. Unfortunately, the vaccines that we already have are only approved for the Zaire strain and probably won't work well for the current outbreak, but we can hope that we get ahead of it soon and save anyone else from contracting this terrible plague. It's trivia time. In my last video, the one on the Edmund Fitzgerald, I asked this question: what were the names of the sister ships of the Titanic? Surprisingly, no one got it right. But the names were Olympic and Britannic. Okay, same rules as always. The first person to comment the correct answer down below gets a shout out in the next video. Good luck. In 1989, the U.S. experienced its own non-human Ebola outbreak that killed more than 40 monkeys. The strain, Reston, was named for a town in which state? Unlike the previous fevers that I've mentioned, this one may be one of the oldest, if not the oldest, hemorrhagic fever. And confession time, this is the only hemorrhagic fever I had never heard of before. Crimean-Congo hemorrhagic fever. This one is a strange one. It's one of the only tick-borne hemorrhagic fevers, but it boasts a very large geographic range. It's found as far south as South Africa and as far north as Russia and Kazakhstan. It's found as far west as Senegal and as far east as Western China. This range makes it geographically the most widespread tick-borne illness. It definitely helps that Crimean-Congo is carried by more than 30 species of hard ticks, but its favorite, so to speak, is the hyaloma tick. This mofo. Want to know some BS about Crimean-Congo? Although people can be infected through tick bites, people are most often infected through exposure to contaminated blood from livestock. What's even more insane is that it doesn't make the animals sick. It's only known to affect humans. 1 day to 2 weeks after exposure, a person will begin to show symptoms. Then, a person may experience the following symptoms: high fever, severe headaches, back pain, joint pain, stomach pain, vomiting, red eyes, flushing of the face, red spots on the roof of the mouth, changes in mood, drowsiness. Around day 4, people often begin to experience severe bruising, severe nosebleeds, and uncontrolled bleeding in injection sites. If a person is going to recover, they will start to show improvement around day 9 or 10. But if not, they may experience kidney failure, liver failure, and respiratory failure. It's not a fun time. Between 30 and 50% of people die from Crimean-Congo fever. There has even been some evidence that giving the medication ribavirin can help, but it's not officially recognized as a treatment. In fact, treatment at this time is mainly supportive. There are no vaccines available, but there are efforts being made to develop one, which is good because between 10,000 and 15,000 cases occur each year. As I mentioned before, this fever is very old. Scientific dating estimates it at being over 3,000 years old, but it wasn't officially recognized for the first time until 1944. There was a disease that broke out among soldiers and agricultural workers. That first outbreak resulted in over 200 cases of Crimean-Congo fever, and it had a mortality rate of 10%. At the time, the illness was called Crimean hemorrhagic fever. Then, in 1956, a hemorrhagic fever occurred in the Congo. After testing revealed that it was the same exact thing as in the fever in Crimea 12 years earlier, the name was updated to reflect both locations of the fever's outbreaks, hence Crimean-Congo fever. On the other side of the African continent, we arrive at our first mosquito-borne hemorrhagic fever, Rift Valley fever. In June 1912, a strange illness emerged among sheep in Kenya. As quickly as it appeared, it was gone again. It was another 20 years before it reemerged, again in Kenya, along the Rift Valley. This time, it was identified and given a name, Rift Valley fever. It killed 5,000 sheep on a single and very unlucky farm in just 1 month before disappearing once more. Strangely enough, it was another 20 years before it popped up again, this time in South Africa. And my goodness, it was a hell of an outbreak. Before disappearing, it drastically upped the kill count to 100,000 dead sheep and caused 500,000 of sheep to lose their pregnancies. It was also during this outbreak that we learned that the illness could infect and sicken humans. Then bam, it was gone again. This time, it wasn't going to wait 20 years. In 1977, Rift Valley fever popped up again, but this time it was in Egypt, and it was there to fuck shit up. It was the largest outbreak ever seen, and then it ended up costing Egypt more than $115 million at the time. That's $633 million today. It was also the first time that we saw a huge outbreak in humans. 200,000 people became sick, and sadly, 594 died. It was estimated that half of the susceptible animals in the country were infected. The scale is just mind-boggling. This outbreak demonstrated the devastation that Rift Valley fever could cause, and that it should be taken very seriously. So let's take a look at what we know about Rift Valley fever. As previously shown, it mainly affects livestock, but can affect other animals as well, and people. People can become infected in two ways. They can either be infected directly from mosquito bites. Now, many species can carry the Rift Valley fever, but the two biggest culprits are the Aedes and Culex species. All of those outbreaks occurred in years with unusually high rainfall and flooding. More water means more mosquitoes means more mosquito-borne illness. The other way humans can become infected is through contact with flesh or bodily fluids of infected animals. Susceptible livestock include cows, buffalo, sheep, goats, even camels. And those infected through this method of transmission are usually people who work closely with these animals, like vets and butchers. But you don't have to work with these animals to get sick from them. You can also get Rift Valley fever from eating undercooked meat or drinking raw milk. Just another reason to pasteurize, people. All right, let's look at what the unfortunate souls get to look forward to when they're exposed to Rift Valley fever. Incubation is 2 to 6 days after exposure, and most people will have no symptoms, or they'll have mild symptoms that can be easily mistaken for other illnesses, i.e. fever, weakness, back pain, dizziness. For 8 to 10% of people, they will suffer more severe symptoms. A symptom rather unique to Rift Valley fever is that people can develop sores on their eyes, leaving people with blurred vision and decreased vision. And those sores, they can last 10 to 12 weeks. Think that's bad enough? Half of people who develop the sores on their retinas become permanently blind. Now, there is good news. Well, sort of. Less than 1% of people with Rift Valley fever will develop bleeding or encephalitis, which is why the mortality rate is so low. But if you were to develop one of those complications, you may experience headaches, seizures, comas, for those with encephalitis. With bleeding, you may have bloody vomit, bloody stool, bleeding gums, your skin may bleed, your nose may bleed. Half of those patients who develop bleeding die from it. But still, it is incredibly rare. And the upside is the outbreaks themselves are rare, and we do know how to reduce them. Although there was an experimental vaccine used in the 1970s, it hasn't been approved. So there are no publicly available vaccines today. There are vaccines available, however, for livestock in those areas that are prone to outbreaks. So there's that. Also, as with all other mosquito-borne illnesses, bug spray and mosquito net usage is highly encouraged. And there are large-scale projects to reduce mosquito populations overall, not only to protect against Rift Valley fever, but also to protect against malaria and yellow fever and dengue fever. Speaking of dengue fever, dengue is the most common hemorrhagic fever found around the world and has been around at least 1,000 years, if not 2,000 years. It's mosquito-borne and it has been found in over 100 tropical and subtropical countries. But with global warming, we're beginning to see its range growing further north. Fun for us in the Northern Hemisphere. Dengue is a party we really don't want to be invited to. Cases of dengue, according to the World Health Organization, have increased 30-fold over the last 50 years. In 2024 alone, there was a record number of cases coming in at 14.6 million. But, like a lot of other hemorrhagic fevers, the actual number of cases is believed to be much higher, as 100 to 400 million per year. Oh, and even more fun is that there are 4 strains of dengue. Although immunity, if you survive, is lifelong, the immunity is strain specific. What the hell does that mean, you ask? It means that it's possible to become sick with dengue 4 separate times in your life. Oh, and you want to hear some BS? Although an infection with one strain can give you temporary immunity to the other strains, it can also increase your risk of severe illness with the other strains through a process called antibody-dependent enhancement. That happens when the pre-existing antibodies from a previous strain latch onto the virus of a new strain without neutralizing it. It then helps the virus enter the cells, which allows for explosive replication. It means that the virus has free rein and actually boosts the virus's ability to replicate more than if you hadn't had the antibodies in the first place. Then what? The body responds by releasing extreme levels of cytokines. Cytokines are proteins that work to signal the immune system how to react to illness or injury. Cytokines are responsible for identifying where illness or injury is in the body, what kinds of immune cells are needed for the problem, and creating more of whatever types of cells are needed. And more importantly, cytokines can call on reinforcements of more cytokines. They also control inflammation in the body, triggering it or reducing it depending on the situation. When the body releases too many cytokines at one time, it's called a cytokine storm, and it causes severe inflammation that can damage tissues and organs and can cause organ failure and death. During the COVID-19 pandemic, 23% of COVID deaths were directly caused by the overreaction of the immune system, resulting in cytokine storms. What does all this mean? The more times you get infected with dengue, the more likely you are to die from it. Yay! Also, side note, strains 2 and 3 are more likely to cause severe illness initially. Okay, so there are 4 different types, although I think of them more as stages. There are asymptomatic, classic, hemorrhagic, and shock syndrome. 75% of people who contract dengue fever once in their life may never know it because there are usually no symptoms. If you do have symptoms, they'll appear within 5 to 7 days after exposure. The classic type is what most symptomatic cases of dengue look like. Picture fever, nausea, vomiting, rash, muscle pain, eye pain, bone pain, joint pain. P.S. That's why dengue has the nickname of breakbone fever, because it hurts a lot. And it can last from 2 days up to a full week. And as somebody who has broken a bone, nah, I'll pass, not interested. After the person's fever breaks, they enter the critical period, which lasts 1 to 2 days. They will either start showing improvement or they're about to go downhill. If they become sicker, they will develop the hemorrhagic type or the shock type, or possibly both. In that case, they may experience shock, respiratory distress, severe bleeding, organ failure, or death. As you may have already suspected, there are no treatments and care is supportive. Dengue is spread primarily by the tiger mosquito and the Aedes aegypti, aka the dengue mosquito. Just as with other mosquito-borne illnesses, the best way to avoid becoming sick is to avoid mosquito bites altogether through bug spray and mosquito nets. Now, there is a vaccine, but there are so many reasons that you may not qualify for it. The vaccine can't be given to pregnant people, young children, those who have HIV or are immunodeficient, or anyone who has never had dengue before. Remember the antibody-dependent enhancement thing? It doesn't just apply to natural immunity. It can also happen if a person has been vaccinated and then becomes sick with dengue later on. For people who have received both doses of the vaccine, immunity is only about 61% after 4.5 years. So unless they receive a booster, it can actually leave them higher at risk for that antibody-dependent enhancement, meaning severe illness and death. I'm a huge proponent of vaccines, but yeah, avoid mosquito bites, guys. Prevention is the best protection. I have left this one for last. As an American, we are safe from hemorrhagic fevers for the most part, on American soil, that is. But there was a time where that wasn't true. There was a time that yellow fever scared the hell out of a lot of people and even caused presidents to flee from cities. But we'll get to that soon enough. Yellow fever is found widely in tropic and subtropic countries in South America and Africa, with Africa having far more cases. Although we have seen a large decrease in yellow fever cases per year over the last few decades, numbers are still pretty high. According to the World Health Organization, between 67,000 and 173,000 severe infections happen each year and result in 31,000 to 82,000 deaths per year. The disease is spread by 3 species of mosquito, Aedes, Hemorrhagic, and Sabethes. Hemorrhagic sounds like an ancient Greek mythological creature, doesn't it? Okay, but do you want to see the prettiest mosquito in the world? Sabethes is actually really pretty for a blood-sucking monster. Anyway, the nightmare begins with a bite from one of these guys. More than half of yellow fever infections cause no symptoms, but if you do show symptoms, they begin 3 to 6 days after the bite. Symptoms last 3 to 4 days and may include fever, headache, nausea, vomiting, weakness, the usual symptoms. But again, a portion of those infected in the case of yellow fever, around 15%, will experience severe symptoms. High fever, jaundice, bleeding, organ failure, shock. Horrifically, people can experience internal bleeding into the stomach. The blood, when mixed with stomach acids, is broken down and can make the person vomit black blood that has the texture of coffee grounds. The English name yellow fever comes from the jaundice that the disease causes. The virus destroys the liver, leading to hemorrhaging and severe jaundice. The jaundice not only turns the skin yellow, but the whites of people's eyes turn yellow too. Around half of people who experience severe symptoms will die from it, and it usually happens between days 7 and 10. There are no real treatments, and the care is just, say it with me, supportive. There is good news and bad news when it comes to the yellow fever vaccine. It is a single-dose vaccine that provides lifelong immunity. Within 30 days of the vaccine, 99% of people have immunity. And it's not even that badly priced. It's cost-effective. The bad news is that the vaccine isn't able to be given to everyone. Babies under 9 months shouldn't get it, and pregnant women shouldn't get it unless there's an active outbreak. People with severe egg allergies and those with severe immunodeficiency or thymus disorder shouldn't get it either. But the biggest problem with the vaccine is that production can't keep up with the rate of people who need it. And that means that hundreds of thousands of cases still occur each year. And yellow fever still kills 30,000 people or so per year worldwide. Okay, back to the US. Yellow fever is the only hemorrhagic virus to ever cause large-scale human outbreaks in the US that we know of. We believe that yellow fever originated in Africa and was brought to the New World through the slave trade. The first recorded case of yellow fever in the U.S. occurred in June 1693 in Boston. Do you know what else happened in that area, just 25 miles away, in a village called Salem? The Salem witch trials? That will matter in a couple minutes. Anyway, an English fleet of ships that had left from Boston had been in the Caribbean with the goal of stealing the island of Martinique from the occupying French. Between the strong fight that the French put up and the yellow fever that they picked up in the process, they decided to retreat and go back to Boston. By the time that they arrived in Boston in June, half of those aboard had died from yellow fever. The governor of Massachusetts tried to have the men aboard the ships quarantined, but was not successful as some people snuck ashore. But would it have mattered anyway? I mean, not that they knew it, but mosquitoes can fly. 2 weeks from the day that they arrived in port, the first person died of yellow fever in the American colonies and marked the beginning of a new era of disease. Fun fact, Cotton Mather of adjacent Salem witch trials fame was supposed to give a religious sermon on one of the ships when they first arrived back, but he got seasick on the boat ride over and had to turn back, which may have saved his life. But he went on to write some of the first descriptions of yellow fever in the colonies. For hundreds of years, yellow fever fell victim to the theory of miasma. The theory was that it was the air making people sick. They had no idea that it was not the air, but what was in the air. It was also believed to be contagious, which later was discovered to be false. In 1793, the outbreak in Philadelphia was one of the first major yellow fever casualty events in the U.S. It was the capital of the country at the time and caused George Washington, who was still in his first term, to have to flee the city along with other government officials, i.e. Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. After initially going back to Mount Vernon in Virginia, Washington rented a house in Germantown, Pennsylvania, only 8 miles away, where government was held until the fall when people felt safe returning to the city again. Again, they thought the yellow fever was contagious, so 8 miles could have been a safe distance for the time, but since it was actually transmitted by mosquitoes, they probably only had the illusion of feeling safer due to the smaller population. By the end of the pandemic, over 5,000 people in Philadelphia had died from the disease, which was devastating. It meant a tenth of the entire city's population was gone. And this was not the largest yellow fever epidemic. The 1878 yellow fever epidemic in the Mississippi Valley killed over 20,000, but that's a story for another video. In 1881, the first hero in the yellow fever story appeared on the scene. His name was Dr. Carlos Finlay. He was born in Cuba of a French mother and a Scottish doctor father. He spent his childhood in Cuba and France before traveling to the U.S. as an adult to attend medical school in Philadelphia. After getting his medical degree, he returned to Cuba where he practiced general medicine and ophthalmology, the branch of medicine that studies diseases and disorders of the eyes. Over time, he developed a special interest in yellow fever and spent his free time studying it. In 1879, when the U.S. National Health Board Yellow Fever Commission traveled to Cuba, he was chosen to work with them. Now, the commission came to the conclusion that whatever was causing the fever was in the air. Another popular theory at the time was that yellow fever was transmitted through fomites, or contaminated items, in layman's terms. Think bedding and clothing. Now, although the commission believed that it was the air itself, something about the air itself, it gave Carlos Finlay the idea that maybe it was something in the air and not the air itself. Just 2 years before, in 1877, Sir Patrick Manson, the father of tropical medicine, discovered that mosquitoes could transmit disease while working in Xiamen, China. His discovery went on to inspire others to find diseases that are transmitted by mosquitoes, including Carlos Finlay. 2 years after working with the Commission on August 14, 1881, he formally presented his paper, The Mosquito Hypothetically Considered as the Transmitting Agent of Yellow Fever. Unfortunately, he was not taken seriously, and he spent the next 20 years trying to prove his theory, all the while facing universal ridicule from the rest of the scientific community. Over that time, he conducted over 100 inoculations on people, but he could never prove his theory. He was even called the Mosquito Man by his contemporaries. But in 1900, he would get his redemption arc. May I introduce Walter Reed? If the name is familiar to you, it should be. Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, aka Walter Reed Hospital, is the hospital famous for treating Washington, D.C.'s political elite, including presidents since 1940. Walter Reed had a long medical career, gaining his first medical degree in 1869 at 17 years old. Things were different back then. He forwent a career in private practice and joined the military. He was stationed on the frontier for a while, worked and studied at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. He was the curator of the Army Medical Museum for a time in Washington, and he also spent time as a professor of bacteriology and microscopy at the Army Medical School. In 1898, he was chosen as the head of a committee to study typhoid fever in military camps during the Spanish-American War. In 1900, Walter Reed, along with a few others, formed another commission with the goal of learning the cause of yellow fever. They too arrived in Cuba and learned of Finlay's mosquito theory. Although they were skeptical, they decided that they would at least put the theory to the test through experiments. And let me tell you, the methods that they used were rather questionable. Walter Reed left the team behind in Cuba to perform the experiments while he returned to the U.S. Not expecting the experiments to work, they performed their experiments not only on human subjects, but on themselves as well. I mean, what better way to fight back against the ethical criticisms of live human subjects than becoming a subject yourself? In the first phase of the experiments, 2 members of the Yellow Fever Board were inoculated themselves, and at first it did not appear as if the theory was correct. Several volunteers were inoculated with nothing to show for it. On August 16th, Jesse Lazier, member of the board and doctor at Johns Hopkins, inoculated himself. Again, nothing seemed to happen. On August 27th, another doctor and board member, James Carroll, inoculated himself. At this point, they didn't expect for the experiments to actually work. It hadn't worked yet. So they were surprised when Carroll suddenly became really sick with yellow fever. Even after another volunteer became really sick with yellow fever after inoculation, Lazier went forward with a second self-inoculation. It's not really known why he did that, but unlike the other 2 who became sick, Lazier became really sick and he was the first one to die. This prompted Walter Reed to return to Cuba to take over the experiments, but this time with new protocols and guidelines. He was not at all happy with the first phase of experiments that were conducted, and they also began to perform experiments to see if infected linens were capable of infecting people, and wildly, they also began injecting people with the infected blood of yellow fever patients. At this point, they began financially compensating their volunteers with gold. In today's money, anyone who volunteered got $8,000, and if you actually became sick, you'd receive the equivalent of $20,000 in today's money. What's interesting is that the board didn't quite understand how risky the blood injections were. Yes, the blood was infected with yellow fever, but in 1900, blood types hadn't even been discovered yet. Not until the following year. And in case you didn't know, it's extremely dangerous to give people the wrong blood type. But again, that's another video for another day. Anyway, some good did come from the experiments, and they were able to prove that mosquitoes were in fact the vector of yellow fever. But they were able to start fighting back against it by lowering the mosquito populations and developing methods for avoiding mosquito bites. And it also vindicated Dr. Carlos Finlay, who was appointed Chief Sanitary Officer of Cuba, and he finally got credit for his work. It took a while before a vaccine was developed, and that didn't happen until 1937. And the honor of that achievement goes to Max Thieler, who eventually won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, and it's the only Nobel Prize ever given for a viral vaccine to this day. Through efforts to limit mosquito populations, the U.S. hasn't seen an outbreak since 1905, and now with a vaccine available, and in spite of global warming, hopefully we won't be seeing another yellow fever outbreak here again. But only time will tell. And that's it for today. If you liked this video and want to help grow my channel, like this video and subscribe for more dark content. If you just can't wait for more, check out my binge playlist. Want more morbid medicine? Check out one of my oldest videos where I cover prion diseases. And as always, don't forget to be merry, but stay morbid.